All right, so everyone's talking about AI these days. Well, we've been digging into something pretty interesting, how AI models, especially those from companies like OpenAI and Google, seem to express, or maybe we should say reflect, certain political views.
Yeah.
And, naturally, there's a whole debate about whether those views are actually biased or not. So for this deep dive, we've gone through a ton of articles and analyses that look at how these companies are trying to handle this super complex issue. We want to get a better grip on the different approaches they're taking, what works, what doesn't, and all the intricate details, but without making your head spin.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, if you're enjoying these deep dives and want to see more, hitting that subscribe button on YouTube would really help us reach 1,000 subscribers today.
It's really fascinating how this whole issue of potential political bias in AI has become such a central point of discussion. I mean, just the fact that these major AI developers are putting so much effort into figuring out how their model should handle sensitive political topics, that says a lot in itself.
It really does. So let's start with OpenAI. They've been pretty upfront about wanting their models to be more neutral, but they've also admitted that totally eliminating bias is, well, really tough.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the main strategies they're using is this thing called conversational alignment. I think it's important for you, the listener, to understand what that actually means.
Think of it this way. Conversational alignment is all about training the AI to present you with a balanced view of a controversial issue. Like, let's say you ask ChatGPT about different economic policies, right? Instead of pushing one specific agenda, it should explain the arguments for and against various viewpoints.
So it's like the AI is giving you, the listener, the whole picture, a neutral overview of the different sides.
Exactly. It's about presenting information objectively, not taking sides.
Makes sense. Now, they also use something called a constitutional reasoning system. How does that work? And how does it affect the responses you might see?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. The constitutional reasoning system basically acts like an internal editor for the AI. So after ChatGPT generates an answer to your question, this system steps in. It evaluates that answer against a set of predefined principles, kind of like a checklist, to spot and reduce any potential bias. It might even come up with several versions of the same answer, and this system helps pick the most balanced one.
It's like the AI is double-checking its own work, making sure it's not leaning too heavily in one direction or another before it shows it to you.
Yeah, it's like a built-in quality control for neutrality.
Smart. Now, from what I understand, OpenAI also gives developers some flexibility in how they can customize the AI's behavior, right?
Right. They understand that different applications might need the AI to have a specific tone or even play a particular role. Developers can actually tweak those aspects to fit their needs.
So there's some room for tailoring the AI's style, but I'm guessing there are also some pretty strict limits, especially when it comes to preventing, say, misinformation or hate speech.
Absolutely. They've made it crystal clear that they won't tolerate the AI being used for anything harmful. So, yes, there's flexibility, but it's always within these clearly defined ethical boundaries. For you, the listener, that should provide some reassurance.
For sure. Now, OpenAI has come under fire, particularly from some folks on the American right, who claim their models have a woke bias. How has OpenAI tackled these accusations, and what does that mean for the kind of information you, the listener, might encounter?
Well, OpenAI has definitely been paying attention to these criticisms. To try and address them and to avoid being seen as too heavy-handed, they've made some changes to what they call their ideological guardrails.
So what does that look like in practice?
Essentially, they're trying to strike a balance. They want to maintain neutrality, but they also want to make sure they're not silencing legitimate viewpoints. This might mean that the filters they have in place to block certain types of content are a little less restrictive now than they were before. For you, the listener, it's something to be aware of as you interact with these AI models.
Got it. Now let's switch gears and talk about Google. Their experience, particularly with their Gemini AI, seems to have been a bit more, well, let's just say eventful.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Google's attempts to deal with ideological bias have definitely sparked more controversy. One term that kept popping up was problematic consensualism. It sounds a bit jargony, but I think it's important for the listener to understand what it actually meant for how Gemini worked, or didn't work, as the case may be.
Problematic consensualism. It does sound a bit abstract. So what did it look like in practice? How did it affect Gemini's performance in the real world?
Okay, so The idea behind this approach was to make Gemini reflect a sort of broad consensus on any given topic. But what ended up happening was, in trying so hard to avoid offending anyone, it sometimes distorted facts or shied away from sensitive questions altogether.
So it's like it was bending over backwards to please everyone
Yeah.
and ended up pleasing no one?
Exactly. The problematic part was that it sometimes sacrificed accuracy and honesty in the process. For you, the user, this could have meant encountering outputs that were factually questionable or just seemed to dodge certain topics altogether.
Yeah, I remember seeing some of those examples online, and this whole thing led to accusations of bias against Google and even caused them to temporarily suspend Gemini. Right.
That's right. There was a pretty strong public reaction, with many people expressing concerns about a perceived woke bias in Gemini. Google did respond by making technical corrections to the model, but this whole episode really highlights a fundamental challenge that experts agree on. Achieving true objectivity in AI is really, really hard, maybe even impossible.
Which brings us to a really important point for you, the listener. Both OpenAI and Google are facing some common obstacles in dealing with this whole issue of bias. And it seems like a big part of the problem stems from the very data these AI models are trained on.
You hit the nail on the head. That training data at its core is just a massive collection of text and code that was created by, well, us humans. And that data inevitably reflects all the biases and values that exist in our societies.
So the AI isn't forming its own independent opinions. It's basically absorbing the viewpoints that are already embedded in the data it's learning from.
It's like trying to create a perfectly balanced meal from a pantry that's already full of very specific ingredients.
And as we saw with Google's Gemini, trying to correct for those existing biases can sometimes backfire and create new problems.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balancing act. You try to remove one set of biases and you might accidentally introduce another. Plus, what one person considers neutral might seem totally biased to someone else, especially in a world as diverse as ours. It's tough.
Really tough. Now, this whole conversation about bias in AI has also caught the attention of certain groups, particularly those on the American right, who have been voicing concerns about what they see as a left-leaning slant in these technologies.
Yes, this perception of ideological bias in AI has become a major talking point, and not just among everyday users. Organizations like NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, have actually called on these big AI developers to do more to reduce ideological biases in their systems. They want to make sure these powerful technologies are perceived as fair and impartial by everyone.
And there was that executive order back in January 2025 that specifically mentioned AI, calling for systems developed without ideological bias or designed social agendas. Why is that significant for the listener?
Well, this executive order shows that the government is taking this issue seriously. It suggests that there might be more scrutiny and maybe even regulations coming down the line to address perceived bias in AI. For you, the listener, this could mean changes in how AI models are developed and the kinds of outputs they produce.
Wow, so this issue is reaching the highest levels of government. Now, there have been studies trying to quantify this bias in AI models. What have they found about the potential political leanings of these systems?
A number of studies have indicated that many of these large language models tend to lean towards what you might call a left-of-center political orientation. And this wasn't just observed in the US, it was seen in other countries too.
So the research is suggesting that there's a measurable tilt towards certain political views.
Yes, and it's something researchers are still trying to fully unpack. But the findings suggest that, for example, while arguments from the center-left are frequently represented in these models' outputs, perspectives from the hard right appear less often. So yeah, it's a complex finding with potentially significant implications for you, the listener, as you use these technologies.
It really is. And it seems some of the concerns from the right extend beyond just the outputs of these AI models to the very ethical principles that are being programmed into them.
It's a really nuanced point. Take OpenAI, for instance. Their model specifications explicitly state that the AI should condemn human rights violations.
Which seems like a pretty universally accepted ethical principle, right?
Yeah. You'd think so, but some argue that even a statement like that, which seems objectively good, can be seen as aligning with a particular ideology, often described as progressive. So for you, the listener, it raises a really interesting question. Where's the line between a basic ethical principle and a potentially biased viewpoint in these systems? It's tricky.
It is tricky. It all circles back to that fundamental challenge of defining and achieving true neutrality in AI. It feels like trying to pin down a moving target.
It really is. What we consider neutral isn't some fixed universal thing. It's shaped by the cultural and political values of the time and place we live in. What seems neutral to one person might seem biased to another. And that makes the goal of creating a universally neutral AI incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
And some experts have pointed out that if we get too caught up in trying to strip away all guiding principles in the name of neutrality, we might end up making things worse, especially when it comes to discrimination.
That's a really important ethical point for the listener to think about. Removing principles like fairness or responsibility from AI development could have unintended consequences, especially for people who've historically been marginalized and depend on those principles for protection against bias. It's a delicate balance.
It is. And there's also that concern that if people start seeing AI as inherently biased or manipulative, it could just fuel political polarization even more.
Exactly. If AI is seen as promoting one viewpoint over another, it could deepen existing divides and create these echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that reinforces their pre-existing beliefs. That's not a healthy situation for anyone.
So, given all these challenges, what are some potential solutions or alternative approaches that people are talking about? I've heard the term pluralism of AI models thrown around.
That's a really interesting concept. Instead of trying to create one single universally unbiased AI, which we've established is probably not realistic, the idea is to develop a whole range of different AI systems.
A diverse set of AIs.
Exactly. And these systems would be more transparent about their limitations, about the data they were trained on, and the perspectives they might reflect. For you, the listener, this could mean having access to different AI tools that openly acknowledge their potential biases so you can choose the one that best suits your needs or compare different perspectives side by side. It puts the power in your hands.
That's an empowering thought. So, wrapping up this deep dive for you, the listener, the takeaway is that these major AI developers are wrestling with a really complex issue: how to handle ideological bias in their models. They're trying different strategies, each with its own set of hurdles, and it's all happening within a very politically charged environment.
Absolutely. As we've seen from all these sources, the challenge isn't just about finding a technical fix for removing bias from massive data sets. It's also about recognizing that what constitutes neutrality is inherently subjective. And even attempts to correct for bias can sometimes create new problems. It's a messy, evolving situation.
It really is. And it leaves you, the listener, with a big question to think about. Since these AI models are trained on data made by us humans, can we ever truly achieve neutrality in AI? Or will some form of human perspective always be baked into these technologies? It's something worth considering as AI becomes more and more intertwined with our lives and the information we consume.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. It's a question we all need to keep asking ourselves as we move forward in this exciting and sometimes unnerving age of AI.
Couldn't agree more.